Hello everyone. We are Susana Linares, Mariana Ugliastri, Nicole Salcedo, and Simon Franco, and we are here to present bilingualism. Does it really benefit our executive functions? First, we are going to make a short introduction to our topic. Then, we are going to talk about the controversy around the bias in the database of our topic. Later, we're going to talk about the existence of bilingual advantages. Then we're going to talk about neuroscience evidence of it. And we're going to finish with a discussion and conclusion of the results of the research. Cognitive scientists and language psychology experts have dedicated a lot of research into the consequences of bilingualism for individuals, and so far it has been proven that bilingualism aids to increase the social, cultural, and economic dimensions of people that know more than one language. Because of this, many researchers have theorized that bilingual individuals outperform their monolingual counterparts in executive functions, and there have even been research papers that prove this from experimental experience. But what are executive functions? They are control processes that self regulate our thoughts and behaviors of nonverbal tasks to accomplish goals. A few examples of executive function tasks are being able to ignore irrelevant information when making a task switching, and resolving conflict. The following experimental research that we are about to present englobes an examination on the theory and research that has been conducted regarding bilinguals outperforming monolinguals in executive functions. Regarding our topic's controversy on bias in database, our research states that in most of the recent research literature, there are more studies saying that bilinguals outperform monolinguals in executive functions than studies saying the opposite. Nevertheless, there have been more non published studies stating that there is no connection between bilingualism and superior executive functions. The explanation for this phenomenon of journals publishing only studies where bilinguals outperform monolinguals can be explained by the research of the researcher psychologist Mahoney, for which one of his research projects in 1977 concluded that psychology publisher experts are biased in favor of positive results over mixed null results. Because of this, the fact that there are more publications in academic literature regarding the advantage bilinguals have over monolinguals on executive functions is biased and not conclusive to the fact that bilinguals hold a true advantage over monolinguals regarding executive functions.
Existence of bilingual advantages. Despite the fact that the vast majority of the published results show that people who speak two languages perform better in the tasks that measure executive functions than monolinguals, there is evidence that shows that there is a possibility that the use of two languages doesn't improve the general executive functions. This is due to type 1 error, confusion with demographic data, and questionable statistical evidence. What is the false positive rate? Although the exact number of false positives cannot be calculated, there is evidence that statistical malpractice increases the proportion of this. In the investigations carried out, it can be observed how some researchers carry out multiple tests with very small samples until they obtain the desired result. In addition to the above, bad statistical practice such as not reporting all the conditions of the study, rounding the p-values so that they are greater than 0.05, among others, generate an increase in the number of false positives. Although this type of practice is not frequent, in a 2012 survey of 2,000 psychologists, 48% admitted to having reported only the studies that work. How often do significant bilingual advantages occur? To determine this, Johnson and Sawi examined the test for bilingual advantages in non-verbal switching tasks and interference tasks. In nonverbal interference tags, the interference score is usually assumed to measure inhibitory control, yield 13 bilingual advantages out of 64 tests. Global RT is often taken as a measure of monitoring ability and yields 6 bilingual advantages out of 46 tests. Switching costs are usually measured as the difference between switch trials and repeat trials in a block where task is randomly varied and Q on each trial. In switch costs were reported 4 significant bilingual advantages of 32 tests. Mixing costs are usually assumed to measure the cost of monitoring and maintaining a task set when a switch is not required. In mixing costs were reported 5 significant bilingual advantages of 23 tests. When all 4 measures are combined, 0.170 of all tests for bilingual advantages yield significant advantages. Confounds can produce significant bilingual advantages. Factors ranging from genetics to the acquisition of specialized skills influence the development and maintenance of executive functions. According to speculation by Hilsche, Saint-Aubin, and Klein, confounding variables may have caused many of the reported bilingual advantages. Some of the confounding variables that can make it difficult to test for bilingual advantages in executive functions are socioeconomic status, immigrant status in F, and the onset of dementia, mainly in the elderly, and cultural differences. Bilingual advantages are sometimes supported by questionable statistics. The should test whether one difference differs significantly from another have played a key role in assessing the presence of bilingual advantages, but the interaction must be statistically real and have the correct pattern. The pattern of interaction matters. Many tests for bilingual advantages in EF employ mixed factorial designs with 2 or more language groups and 2 types of trial. In the Simon-Flanker and Stroop task, interference scores are the difference between the congruent and incongruent trials. If bilinguals have better inhibitory control, then the interference score should be smaller for bilinguals compared to monolinguals. Missing interactions. Calpo and Bialystock explored the joint effects of bilingualism and socioeconomic status on several tasks, including a flanker task, and conclude that the effect of bilingualism and socioeconomic status were independent. The only evidence for bilingual advantage in EF was a significant main effect showing that bilinguals were more accurate than monolinguals. There is very little support in the accuracy data and no support in the RT data for bilingual advantages that one could attribute to advantages in conflict monitoring or inhibitory control. ANCOA cannot statistically control for failures to match. When the independence assumption is violated, the regression adjustment may either obscure part of the grouping effect or produce a spurious effect. The ANCOA results are interpretable when there are systematic differences in the covariate across groups.
On the other hand, the distribution of significant results across sample size is consistent with the null effect. This can be analyzed with the following histograms presented. The first one shows how the number of null reports, left side in the blue, and the number of significant bilingual advantages, right side in green, for different sample sizes, show that null results occur in small, medium, and large studies. Yet, significant bilingual advantages did not occur within larger studies, and these tend to appear when the sample size of the study is considerably smaller. What we can analyze from the data of these histograms is that there's an overestimation of the size of any genuine bilingual advantage, such as that the effect size yielded in studies is considerably small, that it may actually be taken as a null effect. And all of these data shows us that the combined assumption that the null is true and that there is a bias in part of the researchers and reviewers to prefer positive results to null results. Furthermore, we can conclude that seminal studies did not replicate. Successful replications of bilingual advantages studies are unlikely because the typical designs are severely underpowered. These designs can be treated as underpowered because the rate and the probability of obtaining significant advantages in 2 consecutive studies is unlikely. Moreover, significant advantages occur only when dependent variables were transformed and when the parent's educational level (PED) was included as a covariate. This was the case for the prior Angolan 2011 study. However, many experts would consider that the use of PED covariate is inappropriate because there were significant differences between the PED across the 3 groups of participants that were analyzed in the study. Finally, multiple direct replications of the original studies proving bilingual advantages did not yield the same results, concluding that there is actually no further evidence that there are no solid results for considering that there is any sort of bilingual advantage. Considering what the executive functions are, many investigators have anticipated that it will only be a matter of time until we discover the specific type of bilingual experiences that lead to enhancements in the corresponding components of the EF. However, this specific experience has yet to be discovered. Pap, Johnson, and Sawi in 2014 concluded that there is no compelling evidence that either L2 or L1 proficiency ratio or the number of languages spoken predicts performance on any component of the executive functioning. This is only one of the many studies that have proven the same. However, Von Bastian, Sousa, and Gatti in 2015 conducted a study that differed in methodology from the other ones that proved that there is no evidence of enhancement of the EF with bilingualism. This study used 3 aspects of bilingualism as continuous predictors of executive function: age of acquisition, usage, and proficiency. This predictor was used to create 3 groups that differed along composite indicator formed by 3 dimensions of bilingualism. And these bilingualism measures were used to predict 9 different components of executive function. These 9 components were measured with multiple tasks. The results were completely consistent. No aspect of bilingualism or interaction of aspects significantly predicts measures of inhibitory control, monitoring, switching, or a composite reflecting a generalized cognitive advantage. Further confirms the conclusions that age of acquisition, L2 and L1 proficiency, proportion of language use, or combination of this specific experience are not related to EF. In fact, this study showed no relationship at all on any component of EF. Subsequently, there can be considered that there is a lack of convergent validity in the bilingual advantages. This lack of convergent validity means that the standard measures of inhibition or monitoring obtained with the nonverbal interfering task not correlate with one another. If a measure lacks convergent validity, then the individual group or differences are more likely to reflect the combination of chance factor and task-specific factors than actual difference in a domain general component of executive functioning. These occur mainly in convergent validity inhibitory control and convergent validity in monitoring. The first one was concluded by the study of Papa and Zawi that there is little to no convergence between measures of inhibitory control and its correlation to bilingualism and its advantages.
In this section, we'll talk about the neuroscience evidence, discussing about whether or not those neuroscience data provide compelling evidence for a bilingual advantage. Some researchers believe that the inconsistent evidence for the bilingual advantage is related to the studies jointly exploring both behavioral and neuroscience measures, but the authors argue that these inconsistencies are related to 3 main problems in the neuroscience evidence. Those 3 being the alignment problem, the valence ambiguity problem, and the conflict monitoring in neuroimaging studies, which we'll be explaining. First, we have the alignment problem. In general, areas of the brain shown to be involved in managing 2 languages overlap with those shown to be involved with inhibitory control and switching. Furthermore, it is clear from neuroimaging results that the neural processing of bilinguals and monolinguals differs during the performance of executive function tasks. However, these differences doesn't necessarily represent an advantage or more efficient performance. The reorganization of the brain in bilingual people could also lead to a comparable or even inferior performance. So, in order to determine actual advantages in performance, the neural differences must be aligned with the behavioral differences. About this, the author proposes that behavioral phenomena can only be adjudicated at the behavioral level, meaning that these behavioral differences should be prioritized in order to provide evidence for the bilingual advantage. Some evidence of this problem with alignment has been noticed. The Simon task. It is a behavioral measure of interference or conflict resolution. In this task, participants are to visual stimuli by making a rightward response to one stimulus and a leftward response to another. The stimuli are sometimes presented on the right side of the display and sometimes on the left. The location of the display on which the stimuli appear is irrelevant to the accurate performance of the task, but it influences participants' patterns of responding by either matching, which means congruent trials, or not matching, which we refer as incongruent trials, the side of the correct button press associated with the shape. The main dependent measures of interest is contrast reaction time and accuracy for congruent trials against incongruent trials. One investigation reported that two groups of bilinguals showed substantial overlaps in terms of velocity associated with fast responding in this task, and that these markedly differ from the specific areas associated with fast responding for monolinguals. However, these neural differences did not align with the differences observed in behavior. There was a global RT response time advantage for the Chinese English bilinguals compared to both the French English bilinguals and the monolingual group participating in the research, but it was also present in the control condition. So, related to this research, it is possible to assume that there is no evidence for a bilingual advantage in either monitoring or inhibitory task. The flanker effect is that when you need to respond to stimuli flanked by relevant stimuli, the irrelevant one can still affect your response. In the test, a directional response, usually left or right, is assigned to a central target stimulus, which is flanked by non-target stimuli which correspond either to the same directional response as the target, meaning congruent flankers, to the opposite response, incongruent flankers, or to neither, which are neutral flankers. These tests, just like the previous one, are related to inhibitory control. A study made in 2010 claimed finding neural differences between bilingual and monolinguals. It reported that the regions associated with faster responding were the same on both congruent and incongruent trials for monolinguals, but with different regions for bilinguals. Nevertheless, the flanker effects for the two groups were nearly identical. So, the behavioral evidence of the test doesn't support this conclusion of advantages in inhibitory control. The last task is the switching task. In this one, participants carry out 2 trials of task A, followed by 2 trials of task B, and then back to task A. Hence, a task switch occurs every 2 trials. The difficulty to switch between tasks is expressed as the slowdown immediately following a task switch. Researchers in 2013 compared 18 Catalan-Spanish bilinguals to 18 Spanish monolinguals. In a color shape switching task, where cues to either switch or state appear relatively and frequently. There were no differences in behavioral costs, but according to the researchers, fMRI measures showed that bilinguals use language control areas more than monolinguals. And in opposition to the usual belief, the researchers established that the possibility that the brain control of monolinguals is even more efficient than bilinguals in this task. About all the previous examples, we can conclude that even though some neural differences have apparently been discovered, these differences do not align with the behavioral differences, and therefore it is hard and probably wrong to establish that these differences represent an advantage for bilinguals, and also questions if these distinctions could represent a more efficient or equal performance in executive function tasks by monolinguals. Now, we will explain the balance ambiguity problem. The interpretation of neural differences is very risky in the absence of behavioral data that shows the same patterns of significant differences. This answers to the alignment problem explained before. The balance ambiguity occurs when researchers have different opinion about whether an increasing neural score is positive or not. This problem highlights that neural differences alone are not conclusive. They must be interpreted in the context of their behavioral consequences. Some neural differences with these problems are, first of all, have a larger N400 compounds were presented as an advantage in conflict resolution. But then this theory was challenged by some other researchers who made a different interpretation of the test that suggested that a larger N400 actually indicated that the bilinguals were less able to perform the task. Another example is related to the N2 amplitude. Studies found that larger N2 amplitude in Spanish-English bilinguals compared to English monolinguals in a research on both auditory and visual go-no-go tasks conclude that having a larger N2 amplitude represents an enhanced inhibitor control, while other studies strongly suggest that a smaller N2 amplitude reflects superior performance in the dimensional change card task, which is another task for inhibitory control. As a last example, studies made by Abu Talebi in 2012 conclude that bilinguals adapt better to conflicting situations because they seem to require less anterior cingulate cortex activity. This is a structure in the brain responsible for many autonomic functions, which is observed to be more active in response to processing incongruent stimuli than congruent stimuli. The researchers understood this information as if the bilinguals require less activity to outperform the monolinguals, implying that this is a better performance. But then again, there are some questions about whether or not this actually represents an advantage or a better. The last problem is about the conflict monitoring in neuroimaging studies. Neuroimaging studies of conflict monitoring actually study inhibitory control, but these differences in comprehension often result in wrong neural contrasts, which can suggest differences that aren't necessarily true, and then again don't align with the behavioral differences that are.
In conclusion, based on the evidence, advantages of bilingualism regarding executive functions may not exist. Certain experiences that drive a person to bilingualism may improve their executive functions, but in a very small level and just a few components that are yet to be determined. And finally, most studies that proved an advantage of bilingual individuals over monolinguals have not yet demonstrated validity in their methodology.